In reference to your article, can France and United Kingdom replace the US nuclear umbrella? To what extent could deeper Franco-British nuclear coordination, especially if supported by Germany, create a political fraction within the EU, particularly amongst member states that are skeptical of a stronger nuclear posture?
Well, thank you for your question. And we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the potential frictions and the difficulties, but right now I think that we see a political momentum and much more political alignment on these deterrence issues than friction, actually. And to give you an example, and I think it started really last year also, when the German Chancellor took office last February, right away he said that he needed to have a discussion with France and the UK, and that Germany was really interested in exploring European options on deterrence and understand each other better. The Polish Prime Minister made similar declarations. And more recently, at the end of the month of January this year in 2026, the Swedish Prime Minister said he had already had discussions with France in the UK at a very preliminary stage, but that they were pretty much interested. So I think right now we're in a moment where Europeans are actually thinking more seriously about these issues. And it's probably due to the political context and the geopolitical context more broadly. Obviously, in Europe, there's this very acute threat of Russia that is still there, that is very permanent for all Europeans who consider that they might be next, in terms of like risks of aggression and of hybrid warfare. So they're thinking about how to defend themselves across the board. Also, another new factor is changes in the US approach to alliances and alliance management. When you have an official document like the National Defense Strategy of the US that was released recently, that states, really clearly that a threat on an individual halfway around the globe is not the same as one to an American. Well, it raises questions about how credible and robust your security guarantees within alliances are reliable anymore. And so it doesn't mean it's not serious anymore, but probably allies don't want to put their eggs in the same basket, and they want to explore other venues where they could have, discussions and maybe more options to be secure. And when we talk of maybe just one last point to answer to your question, what could be done if we want to think about more proactive endeavors or proactive steps that could be taken. One thing that all Europeans have in mind, I think, and in particular France and the UK, is that their intent is not to substitute the US extended deterrence. It's still pretty much there. Their existence, like the French deterrent and the UK deterrent, are really embedded in the security architecture in Europe that has the NATO mission and the US overall posture as the supreme guarantee of their security. So they don't want to just like go on their own and try out new things. But obviously it's important to have European discussion. So what can be done right now, and that's what I highlighted in some of my articles, is that Europeans have to define what they expect from France and the UK. So what could be security interests that they want to see covered, maybe some concept that they don't understand in their doctrines that they might be interested to know better. So really defining common interests and common understandings is one, I think, primary step that is, paramount to all subsequent steps. And then you have the creation of formats. So it's probably already happening, as the Swedish Prime Minister hinted recently. So it's probably bilateral or ad hoc multilateral format that can maybe mingle officials, but also what we call track 1.5. So that's when you invite researchers and people who are not in the official spheres, sometimes it gives ideas, a bit like out of the box. So that can be useful for this type of more creative thinking on nuclear deterrence in Europe. And obviously, and that was probably the case so far, it has to be secret to get started. So everybody's confident enough to really like put what they have in mind on the table and be very very candid in their request. And you cannot really do this when you're like under the spotlight and you have maybe a fear that either an adversary or even like friends who might be too interested in knowing what you're doing looking at the discussion. So there is this creation of format that's probably like the secondary thing to do. And then more concrete options that Europeans have to look at in like quick wins in the short terms. And most probably they're not going to build like a Eurobomb, what's floated sometimes in the media. But what they can do more rapidly is work on what's called the mutual support. So the conventional side of the nuclear domain of nuclear raids and nuclear actions in general. And this mutual support is very important in Europe, because if there is more done on the nuclear side, you don't want the nuclear threshold to be perceived as lowered. You have to show that Europeans could be able to manage, a high intensity conflict. And so they have to work on their escalation management options and tools. And so I guess working on this conventional domain is going to be also paramount in the coming months and years for Europeans.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, your point of view. Dan, I want to ask you, in relation to your article, France's nuclear offer to Europe, and considering France's doctrine of strict sufficiency and the limited size of its arsenal, how feasible would it be for Paris to assume a more independent nuclear guarantor role for Europe in general? And what doctrinal or structural adjustments would such an evolution require?
Yeah, thank you. I think the point that you touch on the size of the arsenal is often the point that allies raise, or even Americans who look at the European options and are like, well, that's not credible because you cannot do it. You don't have a matching arsenal compared to Russia, for instance, or even China when we look at the trajectory in the coming decade. And I think maybe that's one point that we need to tackle, first when you think about these things, because the French doctrine in particular is not the same as the US doctrine. So the US extended deterrence is basically based on this idea of damage limitation, so that you could wage a war far from your territory, and it would, limit the damages on your own territory. For France and the UK, you cannot really do that because the theater is much smaller. You don't have this depth geographically. And also it's reflected in the doctrine, which is a doctrine in France of what's called unacceptable damages. So the goal of your doctrine is to inflict enough unacceptable damages on your adversary, or to be capable to do so, so your adversary is deterred and doesn't attack you in the first place. And in this regard, when you think about unacceptable damages, you don't need to match the arsenal of your adversary. You just need to have a size of arsenal that, based on your threat assessment, can inflict these damages to your adversary. So basically, it means being able to penetrate their defense, for instance. And so it would be much more dependent on, for instance, ballistic missile capabilities and interception capabilities of an adversary than just the number of warheads that they have. And in this regard, I guess the French threat assessment hasn't changed in a way that makes it very important to raise the number of missiles in its nuclear arsenals so far. So I guess for Europeans, when they're having these discussions, it's important to maybe not think about changing the doctrine to replicate something when it's not even the aim, but to explain the doctrine and show how it can be useful in this context. Again, I emphasize that the French doctrine does not is not meant to replace the US deterrent whatsoever. Historically, it has always been complementary. It's even stated in all the declaratory policy, even NATO's declaratory policy to some extent. There's this sentence, sometimes called the Ottawa Declaration, that exists since 1974, that says basically that the UK and French different centers of decision making are contributing to the deterrence in complement to the US Supreme Guarantee that's for NATO. So I guess there is no questioning about that, but it doesn't preclude Europeans and allies in general to elaborate a plan for more robust nuclear contribution, especially in the European context and in the nuclear domain. And so, as I mentioned previously, it requires building trust among allies. I like this sentence that you might have heard before, but deterrence is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. So you have to have your allies who you want to embark on this adventure, but also your adversaries to feel that you're credible. So you have to explain why you're credible. So for allies, it means having thorough discussions, maybe behind closed doors, but sometimes it also can mean having signalings that are more evident to adversaries. And in this regard, we can think about steps that would signal a deepened cooperation with or among European allies. The French president had mentioned in a previous discourse, and he should have a new second discourse in the coming days or week. Apparently it's for February, so it should be soon. So I don't know what's in it, but in the first discourse, he mentioned participation to exercise. And we have seen, Italian tankers participating to French exercises, but these kind of things are always being done very discreetly. There is not a lot of publication around it or communication publicly. It's more like medias would pick up like, oh, we've seen that, like specialized medias. So maybe just owning it a bit more and having like a proactive communication could be something that is done in the coming years. And maybe this participation to exercise start, as observers, and allies just get, more familiar with how it works. And then you can think down the lines, and after a lot of discussions, to participate maybe on the conventional side and have what we call non-nuclear participation to a nuclear mission. And maybe to conclude on that, on things that could be done further down the line, is what I mentioned about the conventional forces and have better escalation management tools, a real like vision of a European way to wage war and keep the nuclear threshold as low as possible, but being able to fight an intense warfare in the European theater on the conventional side, if need be. So that's a lot of work already for Europeans, I guess. So yeah, that's my take on what could be done in the coming weeks, months, years.
Thank you. So, generally speaking, do you think Europe can simultaneously strengthen its security posture and remain a credible advocate for nuclear risk reduction, or are these objectives increasingly in tension?
Increasingly what, sorry?
In tension.
Well, no, in the past, we have seen that there has been this approach that was called in NATO the dual track approach. So on the one side, you reinforce your posture, and on the other side, you look at the parameters that would be a part of arms control or disarmament negotiations. And it has always worked hand in hand. Usually, actually, deals were strike when there was a sort of alignment, there was a pressure in terms of arms racing or risk of arms racing, and that brought parties to the table to actually negotiate more disarmament and non-proliferation and arms control. So I don't think it's inherently in tension. It's a fine balance to strike. And obviously, to be credible in your posture, you cannot arrive and be like, oh, I'm developing this system so they could be covered by arms control. That tactically, that doesn't work. But obviously, you think about your posture in a way that either mirrors or would push your adversary to want to negotiate with you, so you don't go both in an arms race that would be detrimental to both, either financially or militarily, because it heightens the risk of conflict. So I think, on the contrary, we might see more incentives in the coming years, even though right now it's hard to see, perspectives, but definitely they're probably going to be more intense negotiations because the risks are going to be perceived in a more acute way.
Thank you so much. And just one last question. What do you see as the core insecurity in driving renewed discussion about European nuclear options? And do you think this insecurity is primarily military, political, or psychological in nature?
Well, most probably the discussions are driven by the war of aggression of Russia in Ukraine, that has shown Europeans that the continent is not war-proof, and that they are pretty much vulnerable to an aggression in the not so distant future. So I think that's the main driver, that what has pushed Europeans and NATO allies in general just to revive their thinking about nuclear issues. And we have seen a shift in the way that things were discussed before 2022 and after 2022. It's much more concrete. So I think that's the primary driver. But obviously, you mentioned a psychological effect, and I wouldn't use that term, to diminish the perception. On the contrary, and especially in deterrence, perceptions are very important. And we might have forgotten what in the French doctrine we call the nuclear grammar. So the fact that people are fluent talking about nuclear concepts and are at ease talking about it and understand what they talk about. And I guess during the Cold War, the public and public opinions were much more used to hear about it. There were, like all these nuclear drills and stuff like this that made the population probably more resilient. And right now we see that populations have been used to like not see wars, or it was something more distant for them. So there is definitely a need to have more public discussion. So I guess that's one of the reasons why initiatives like yours are very important to make it more palatable for the public, more understandable. So it's not only super conceptual, or maybe it explains concepts that might be very obscure to the public, and it demystifies a lot, because otherwise you only hear, for instance, like very coercive nuclear rhetorics coming from Russia that are very scary. And maybe if you understand, for instance, that nuclear weapons in the first place are not meant to be used, contrary to like conventional weapons, because they're like political weapons, that's something interesting maybe to understand, to nurture your thinking about these issues, and how maybe they can be, on the contrary, a balancing force in the current situation, and that they might have prevented further aggression from Russia. So I guess the civilian resilience that's built in nuclear policy is also very important to discuss these days.